Well, thank you so much. I'm glad we were able to clear the room. You know, it's the last, it's the final panel, but I think it's actually going to be a really fun one because we have some really great directors who are really thinking about the work that they do, not just about, and also about why they do it. So I want to, my first question, because you know the time is counting down, is really about representation. I know that there was a lot of conversation earlier about diversity in film and representation and what does it mean, but I really want to know, as a filmmaker creating stories in Los Angeles, sometimes also about Los Angeles, what does that sort of mean in terms of the burden of creating a story that actually represents so much, either culturally, you know, also when we're dealing with gender, what's the burden that happens with that as well? And I'd love to start off with Amanda.
I don't know if I take it as a burden as much as I'm going to tell a story that's true to my experience and the experience of the people that I know and love in the world. And so I don't feel of it as a burden as much as just telling a story that I see as something that rings true and is honest. And that's how I've made my way through my film day by day, is saying, like, does this resonate as something that's real or not? And then that's the direction that you would go in.
And talk a little bit also about the film about Echo Park.
My film is called Echo Park. It takes place in Echo Park here in Los Angeles. You guys should all watch it. It's on Netflix. But Echo Park is about a couple, an interracial couple, but it's really about a sense of place, and it's about privilege, and it's about race, but it's in these ways that are untalked about and subtle, and because those are just real things that happen in our life every day. That's not really the point of it. It's just that those are normal, and that's the kind of normal life we're leading, and where are we going to find our place in the world.
What about you, Andrew? And I guess more burden, but with challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I definitely felt the burden of representation because there's not a lot of Asian American film that gets a big platform like Spa Night did at Sundance, and it wasn't just Asian American, but it was also queer, and it was this intersection that I was nervous about. And actually, you know, at one of our Q&As that we had in LA a few weeks ago, this Korean American man, an older man, you know, he made this comment during a Q&A about how he was afraid that this would be how the greater, like, you know, American community would, this is how they would see Korean Americans, and that he hopes that they don't think that that's what the Korean American community is like. And that really upset me because my goal was just to try and show one perspective, you know, that I wanted to show, sure, maybe a niche perspective, you know, but that for, you know, that 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100, it would be really meaningful to see yourself represented on screen. And so for me, in holding on to a sense of humanity and believing in giving a specific perspective on the world and about this community, you can avoid the kind of rep sweats, you know.
Right. Well, I think it's really hard to. The burden isn't on you to tell everybody's story or the entire Korean American story. It's to tell this singular story, and the idea that the audience comes back to you and says, "But I wasn't represented in there." But then you do have this small sliver that was, and they're grateful for it. And I think Barry was saying something about it earlier too. Is just what you see, what we're able to see now, and all of us in the films that we're making, is a wider representation and opening things up. It's not closing things down. So how can it be a burden if we're opening it up?
I think just the question about the burden really comes from the fact that when you're working in a sphere where you don't actually see a lot of representation, sometimes it comes on you to make sure that representation, when it goes out into the world, sort of what am I reflecting? If I'm talking about, you know, Korean Americans in terms of being gay, if I don't see any other, you know, representation, the burden actually comes from the fact that people think that's the only way, you know, in terms of moving in the world as a Korean American. You're representing so much.
Right, so then for me, it's about how do I take this weight and like shift it and allow it to be productive and inspire other like Korean American, other queer voices to tell their story that's different from
Right,
mine, so
broaden
that
it
there's a
out.
diversity and that gives this community a sense of humanity, you know.
What about you?
What about you? No,
Alex,
I mean,
talk also a little bit about the work that you do, too.
sure. Well, let's see. So I've been working in images and telling stories for about 20 years, doing some documentaries, some animation, feature film, which was Sleep Dealer, which was at Sundance several years ago now. It was science fiction. I'm working in virtual reality now and on a documentary. But Los Angeles, I mean, I thought maybe I'd tie it back a little bit to this question of this place. And you know, Los Angeles is a confounding place. I was raised in New York, and I came out here, started to come out here in the 90s through really through the Chicano underground. You know, I was making work about the border, about the sort of mental borderlands that I think Latino families live in, that my family lived in, that I grew up in. Even though I was in New York, I kind of had an affinity or sort of envisioned my family as living in a kind of borderland. And I made this work, and that connected me to these Mexican-American artists here in Los Angeles. And I started to come out here and started to see this kind of conundrum, which is Los Angeles, you know, is this place that's so visible. It's this capital of image making. It's the most represented place on earth. And yet it's so invisible or so unseen or so misunderstood, or there's so much we don't see. And so I don't know if I'd call it a burden. I definitely call it like a charge to enter story making, storytelling, filmmaking, and story making with this spirit of wanting to go into those areas that are underrepresented and try to create a vision of a California, a vision of a Los Angeles that is more like what is here, you know. And so for me, that's been working with day laborers, working with immigrant youth, working with all kinds of people that fill the city with life and humanity that are also chronically and malignantly kind of shut out of access to the storytelling apparatus that's here. You know?
And what sort of inspires you in terms of not just being a filmmaker, but also being an activist? What inspires you to make sure that the films that you're creating also sort of influence or the activist work that you do?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't call myself an activist, but I think when you enter filmmaking, it's like, why? You know, we can do many things with our life energy. We only live once. What are you gonna? Why? Why do films? And some people want to just tell a great story, entertain, make some money. That's fine. But for me, the impulse has always been coming from a sense of crisis. You know, I grew up in the 90s during the time of AIDS, during the time of Prop 187 out here, during who I'd call mini Trump, Pete Wilson here in California, attacks on immigrants, the border wall. All that was resonating in my mind in the mid-90s, and I didn't feel like going off and doing just, whatever with my energy. I wanted to confront those issues and do something meaningful. It's not an activist impulse, it's just an impulse to engage with the world and fight for your own family and your own decency and a sense of hope. And filmmaking is like a wonderful way to do it. It's like a way that's fun and sensual and visual, and it can also be deeply, deeply meaningful. So
And engaging.
yeah. So I saw all of it in there, and so that's where the impulse comes from.
And now, what about you, Amanda? Because you're also a photographer, and a filmmaker. What was it about, sort of telling a story about Echo Park that really resonated with you?
Well, it was about understanding that, because I came to filmmaking from photography, that the story of Echo Park, and I actually live in Echo Park, and it was a place that I understood. So I understood that I had the tools to tell that story, and I knew the place well enough, and I knew that my attention to detail and my experience that I knew how to tell that story. So it was very much because I had a sense of place, and I didn't come from some outside and say, like, impose on anything. It was really about, in a way, just being true to myself, like I was saying, and that really helped make it so you'd feel it.
And now, Andrew, for you, it's also because when you're thinking about the story that you're trying to tell, and you're looking at the fact that there aren't a lot of stories, or really any stories out there like it, how difficult was it for you? Like, what was the process from sort of idea conception? You also worked in the labs, and now you're sort of focusing on the release as well. What has that process been like? and how was it more difficult or easier than you thought it was going to be?
There were challenges that I expected, and then challenges that surprised me. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I wanted to tell a story about Koreatown, but about a subject, about queerness, that not a lot of Koreatown is super comfortable talking about. And so, we lost locations. We had actors, tell me that they didn't want to be in the film because of the subject matter, and that really upset me because it made me realize why films like Spa Night don't get made. It's because there are these obstacles that are unique to a specific culture, to a specific environment. And so for me, I had to take these obstacles and not let them paralyze me, but to motivate me through the process. And I think that the thing that I was trying to get at, that the lab process, and I went through the Sundance Screenwriters Lab, I went through the Film Independent Labs. What it taught me that was, what I was going to do was a little bit radical, in that I wanted to tell a story about a community, but defined within itself, and not defined by a mainstream, predominantly white culture. And so David, my main character, his dilemma isn't like, oh, I go to a gay bar and a white gay man tells me that he's not interested in Asians. David's dilemma is that his sexual identity is at odds with his family's expectations of who he is, and their hopes and dreams for his success. And so in trying to make a film about Koreatown, I was being very careful that it wasn't about an outsider's view of Koreatown, but that it was how Koreatown perceives itself. And for me, that to me is about trying to forge an authentically Asian American culture and identity that doesn't have to center whiteness.
And what are the challenges when it comes to thinking about your audience then, right? What are the challenges when is your audience, Korean Americans? Is it, obviously you're trying to go for a wider audience too. How do you, go into a community? How do you talk about, the thing that you're creating that even within that community itself is controversial?
Yeah, I think, I love the word meaningfulness, that your work has to do something, because, Spa Night was a micro-budget feature, but it's still a lot of money that could go to other places. And so for me, it was about creating a document, about creating a piece of art that could do work for society. And, it's a little bit blasphemous to say, but I was like, if not every eyeball in the world sees it, but just the right ones, the ones who need it, then I'll be happy that there's a fulfillment in that. It is really tricky. I waffle back and forth between saying this is a gay Korean movie for gay Koreans, and then being like, oh, but everybody can enjoy it. And I think it ultimately for me boils down to this, that I don't understand why niche stories cannot be appreciated, cannot teach audiences about our global community and the diversity that exists within humankind. And so for me, it's about these films getting a bigger platform. It's about kind of taking away the importance of the mainstream and waiting for studios to help make these movies. It's no, let's do it ourselves, and let's have audiences be excited for those films.
Well, I think
go ahead.
Saying something's a niche story, all stories have general themes, right? So it's about struggle, it's about finding yourself, and you don't have to be hopefully, more and more people understand you're not going to have to be a gay Korean American to relate to an individual struggling,
exactly.
And that's why it's not just for a specific audience. It's really for somebody who enjoys storytelling or filmmaking or, a spa.
Yeah.
And also, what about you? One of the things I love about the work that you do, Alex, is the fact that you sort of think about it in terms of the future, right? It's not always about looking at the past, but it's about using science fiction, using a different kind of genre storytelling. Can you talk a little bit about the influence in that in terms of your work?
Oh, well, I grew up in a house, like I was mentioning, a kind of mental borderland. I mean, my dad is from Peru, left because of hunger and violence. My mom is from New Jersey, and I grew up in this kind of multicultural space in New York, multilingual, but watching Star Wars like everyone else, and then as a young man watching Blade Runner like everyone else, and I just like so many, like everyone else, I loved those stories. But then as an adult, I started to realize that two things. One is the lack of diversity in those texts, and then the second was that they were always stories of rebels. Like Star Wars is this this guy, this peasant farmer whose house is attacked by an Imperial army, and he gets in like the trunk of Han Solo's spaceship and crosses space borders, and everyone's cheering for him. Go get past the guards, And then we're building a border wall, and the people that are actually fleeing Imperial armies, which happens to be ours, and crossing borders, we're locking them up. Luke Skywalker gets an action figure made out of him for being this rebel underground guy, and then people like my cousins who are coming here to survive, well, we'll put them in detention centers or deport them or jail them. So I started to think maybe in that weirdness and that dissonance there was an opportunity. Maybe we could make like genre films that told our stories, And so I started to dream about this science fictional story that looked at the life of a migrant and centered a Spanish-speaking migrant, in this case from Mexico, as the hero. And and so I took 10 years to make. But so anyways, the future, I could talk at great length. You probably can tell I like to talk. But I could speak a lot about the future and the necessity of having an imagination, a racialized and diverse imagination of the future. It's important territory. If we can't dream about tomorrow and see ourselves there in the future, then we can't do anything. We need to have dreams of the future in which we are present, in which we are powerful, in which we're reflecting on our hopes and our dreams and our fears, and science fiction, it's starting to go there. When I made my film, there really wasn't much of that conversation happening. Now it's starting to percolate, and it's thrilling to me. It's going to reinvigorate science fiction, I think, when it starts to become more global and more diverse. When the aliens, people who are called aliens, start to make science fiction, then we're doing better.
And my last question before we sort of throw it out is really sort of thinking about, when you're looking at the difficulties of making film, it's hard to make films, no matter what. What are some of the challenges for you in terms of making films, in terms of thinking about, your career forward? Like, what do you, we talked a little bit about, creating a National Film Board of the U.S. And that might actually level the playing field. Like, what do you think is sort of missing right now? Andrew?
Okay.
I think for me, it's about finding support, whether it's like a National Film Board or granting or audiences supporting film, because I think like the crazy thing for me is, I screened at a film festival at Seattle International Film Festival, and right next door they were playing Captain America, and I was like, oh my God, Spa Night's playing next to Captain America, and that's really exciting. And someone like came into the Spa Night theater, and then they like left, and then they went into Captain America because they were in the wrong place. But for me, it's like a smaller film can have these platforms, and it's about audiences who are demanding these studios to not whitewash characters, that they then put their money where their mouth is and go to see the movie that does show diverse characters and stories about people of color. So it's about going to see the films that are already doing the work that just are harder to find. And so for me, it's really about I try to watch every Asian American feature that I can, because I feel like that's important for me to do. And so it's about supporting our communities and about being keeping on top of what's coming out.
I think it's really important. I think that social justice isn't always what we think it is, but it's also about seeing yourself in so many different spaces and knowing there's a future.
Regarding race in film, we have it's a total emergency. It's a total emergency. In this city, the city is over 50% Latino. Directors, producers, writers, around 1 and 2% Latino in this city. It's a total emergency. It's a totally fucked up situation, and something radical has to happen to change it. You've got a better chance of having your brain operated on if you get in a car crash by a Latino surgeon than you do seeing a film on TV made by a Latino filmmaker, while you're in your hospital room. You got a better chance of having a Latino mayor of the city who's taking care of life and death than of having a Latino studio executive in this city. I mean, this city has decided to trust matters of life and death all over the city to Latinos. Of course, we do everything, but not make films. It's seriously, it's a mess. And I don't think it's going to be changed by us going to see movies. I mean, that's a great thing to do. I believe in it. I would like to do it. I have a daughter. I haven't seen a movie in years, but but something radical has to happen. And so that's why I've been talking about a national film board that has a mission of creating films that tell the national story, like they have in Canada. In Canada, they have a national film board, disperses about $50 million a year for a citizenry of 30 million people. We have 300 million people in this country. If we had a film board that funded the way Canada does, we'd have a film board of $500 million a year going just into film, not the National Endowment of Arts, just film, which we wouldn't have enough filmmakers to make that many films. You know what I'm saying? But that's reality. Australia, if we funded the same way Australia does, our national film board would fund like $1.2 billion. It's absurd. But anyways, we don't, in this country, we only have really two options from the filmmaker point of view. You go through the grant system, you fight tooth and nail. God bless Sundance, God bless Tribeca, these institutes that support filmmakers to get it done, the first film. But then what do you do if you're a filmmaker? Well, you go to Hollywood. You only have one option to make a living and make your work, which is work in the industry. But the industry doesn't want filmmakers of color who want to tell stories about gay Koreatown. It's not what I'm sorry, it's not what the industry wants. So there's a mismatch. I went through the Sundance Film Festival, got shot out, and it was a beautiful, life-changing experience. So wonderful. Then where do you go if you're a Latino Marxist who wants to make films? Where do you go? You know what I mean? There's nowhere to have career sustenance, And so we need to have some kind of a powerful institution that is willing to put money into telling the American story, telling the truth, telling films that aren't there to make a buck, but are there to make the world a little bit truer. And that's my rant.
Well, we have time for, I think, one question. We'll come back to you, Amanda. Oh.
Hi, my name is Yasmin. I'm with The Advocate, the LGBT magazine. I have a question for Andrew, and kind of building on Barry also earlier. It kind of is almost like you're charting new territory in a way, because a lot of these types of stories haven't really made it to film before. And I'm curious, who your models were in terms of, not really having any kind of, movies like this that existed before that weren't just stereotypes or even really depicting gay Koreans in your case.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I feel like it wasn't film, right? It was different mediums. And I remember in college when I was kind of coming out to myself, and I had this moment where I was like, do I know any gay Korean people? And I realized I didn't. And that the only person I could think of was Margaret Cho, as a queer Korean American, but I didn't even know her personally. And as I was developing the screenplay for Spa Night, and a lot of this story happens in a Korean spa, there was an article that was published by Margaret Cho about how she got kicked out of a Korean spa, and how because she's Korean American but doesn't, has tattoos and is queer, that she was kind of being denied her Korean identity, and that for her she had to fight for it more, and that made her even more Korean. There was something about that resonated with me so intensely, and I was like, I'm gonna make this movie. I need to make this movie. Of course, I have lots of filmmaker influences and many queer filmmaker influences, but it does feel like something that's just kind of about a personal expression.
Well, I want to thank you guys so much for joining us.
Moira.
That was great.
Yeah,
you,
that was
guys.
awesome. Of course.